Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Martin, and I am the Community of Practice moderator, and I'm going to be your host today, along with several other people who will be introducing themselves as we go along. So welcome today for our webinar, Exploring Faith and Spirituality in Response to GBV Survivors. And we're going to look at the implications for humanitarian practice. Now, this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the PowerPoint slides with you afterwards. So what we're going to do today is first, I will do this brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to our three speakers. We have three speakers who are going to speak in plenary. We won't have time to do Q&A with them individually, so we do encourage you, if you have a question after any of the presentations or during the presentation, please put it in the chat, and the speakers will be monitoring the chat box to be able to respond to you as well, so you get a chance to talk to them. After that, we will then we're going to break into small discussion groups. So the discussion groups, we have 5 different groups. We've pre-selected for many of you, we've put you already into a discussion group, but if that's not the one you want to be in, just let us know. The first group will be led by Sandra Iman Pertek, one of our co-hosts and our speakers today. The second one is going to be with Ms. Juliet Enna, who is going to speak a little bit about her experience from Nigeria. The third one, we were hoping that Mr. Anthony Keaty would be able to join us from Abad, and he also could help with Arabic translation, but they've been having a lot of technical difficulties, as you know, in Lebanon, so he may not be able to join us, but Lisa has graciously offered to step in, but she does not speak Arabic. So the group 3 may not be with Arabic. Group 4 will also be looking at the Middle East, also not with Arabic. And then group 5 will have French interpretation. We ran into a small technical difficulty with Zoom. It does not yet allow interpretation in breakout rooms. So we will keep the French interpretation because that's where we had the most requests for support. And that you will stay in the plenary to meet with Francesca Quirk. And we'll give you a little overview again before we move into the small groups to help you figure out how to make sure you're able to jump into the discussion groups. So before we start, we just wanted to set the tone and to look at the way we want to treat each other. Here at the Community of Practice, because some of you may be new to the GBV AoR Community of Practice, here at the Community of Practice, we're striving to create a safe, supportive learning space for GBV practitioners to be able to learn and address the best ways to prevent, mitigate, and respond to gender-based violence in emergencies. And so this is a new topic for us, working with faith-based organizations. And so we wanted to just welcome you all to our Community of Practice space. And we're very glad you came. And just remind everyone of our group rules whenever we're interacting on the topic of gender-based violence. We always ask everyone to please be kind, respectful, and courteous to each other. The best way to learn is, by listening and speaking kindly and not, aggressively. We're not the internet here. We're going to have in the breakout rooms, we're giving you all this option to use this Jamboard, which is a place that's like a little bulletin board that you can write comments on. And you can use that anonymously. You do not have to be signed in, so that can be anonymous comments. So we do allow that. We hope to encourage you to participate and share during the breakout rooms to have your say and to be able to have a good conversation happening. And we're using what we call Chatham House rules. So what Chatham House rules means is the things that we're talking about today, it does not mean that you cannot share what you heard on the webinar, but it just means that you shouldn't attribute it directly to whoever spoke about it. So if I say something, you wouldn't say Sarah Martin from the AOR said blah, blah, blah. You would say one of the participants said this. So we don't want to silence you by any means, but at the same time, we keep it without it being direct attribution to any of the speakers. As always, we always adhere to the concepts of the survivor-centered principles. So we promote confidentiality, safety, and non-discrimination in our activities and our work. So that's just a little overview of our group rules. So without any more ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I hope you can all hear me and see me. So thanks for having me today. I'm a GBV researcher and gender practitioner. And my talk today is about the faith in exclusion spectrum in GBV response. This is a new term I would like to introduce to you based on my research that I will introduce now. First, many thanks to University of Birmingham IRIS Institute, a Center of Excellence for Research in Migration and Superdiversity, for hosting my work, and many thanks to my supervisors. I think one of them, Jenny Fillimore, is here with us, and for generous support and participation of all respondents. I draw upon an intersectional analysis and the premise that social identities are intersecting and shape GBV experience. I focus on religion as an integral part of social identity, as a factor shaping GBV experience. So far, a lot of attention was paid to mainstreaming sensitivity to gender, age, diversity, disability, sexual orientation, but somehow religion is overlooked as a cross-cutting issue. Religion often appears as taboo. It is commonly known that religion influences people's mindsets, behaviors, attitudes. We know it can empower and disempower people. It is a powerful agent and an important coping resource in crisis. In fact, worldwide, over 8 in 10 people identify with religious affiliation. This alerts us that it might be religion, an important dimension with which GBV sector needs to engage with to respond and mitigate GBV in humanitarian settings. But what does it mean for GBV sector? I will respond to it today. Research overview. In the next slide, I just present the key questions guiding this work. So first, I ask, how do humanitarian service providers account for religion? And second, how religion influences GBV experience in forced migration. My preliminary findings draw upon mixed research methods. Ethical approval was granted by University of Birmingham, and this work is in progress. Please feel free to comment by emailing me. A survey was open to all stakeholders in late 2019 and to early 2020. It was a closed question survey with several open questions. 25 humanitarian practitioners participated in the survey, 10 from non-faith NGOs, 7 from faith-based organizations, including 3 from our international organizations. There was a spectrum of participants from across regions, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. You can see it on the screen. On the other hand, I had conducted key informant interviews with 16 stakeholders from regional and national offices. There were mainly international respondents while working on the ground in Lebanon, Iraq, Pakistan, and other countries. And in addition, I interviewed a Syrian and Iraqi and sub-Saharan forced migrant women in Turkey and Tunisia. In total, I think I engaged 38 women. So in terms of terminologies, before I move forward to the findings, by religion, I wanted to tell you, I mean religious beliefs, practices, experiences, and organizations as a category that is socially constructed, but also for many people, it carries a spiritual, transcendent dimension. So what I've learned from the survivors is that there are diverse religious expressions shaped by different factors. First point I want to make today is that the survey and interviews with stakeholders point to what I call the spectrum of faith inclusion in exclusion in GBV responses. The varied ways service providers accounted for religion in their practice arose from the spectrum, with accounting for religion on the one end and not accounting for religion on the other end. While online respondents varied in self-reporting faith sensitivity in the GBV work, scoring in the Likert scale from 1 to 5, on average 2.92. Around a third of interviewees fell on at the non-accounting for religion, and 2/3 shared accounts of different ways and motives of engaging with religion with varying degrees of faith sensitivity. Service providers accounted for religion to different degrees according to the context, cultural relevance, conflict sensitivities, their capacities, including organizational policies, humanitarian infrastructure, and attitudes, personal beliefs to religion. In the next slide, I share with you some top-level results from the surveys with some background insights. So really quickly, there's a promising pattern. A third of online respondents consider the GBV work to be faith sensitive. and another third sometimes when possible. However, almost half of survey respondents reported that accounting for religious faith or faith identity of GBV survivors in their work. So only half of them did not account for it, and only a fifth accounted for it, and a fourth did when possible. Quite alerting is that online respondents attributed greater importance to psychosocial needs compared to religious and faith and spiritual needs. Less than half agreed very much that those MHBSS needs are related to religious and faith spiritual needs. In practice, a sixth of online respondents use religious and faith or spiritual resources to support GBV survivors' resilience and healing. And now I'm going to go to the spectrum. So based on this rich data from the interviews, I propose this typology and identify inactive, reactive with instrumental and instrumentalist and pragmatic strands, and then active and the split approach. I will briefly explain that what it means. Due to time limits in very brief terms, you could perhaps see if we click a very quick example, just a little click, and we're gonna see that there was one practitioner in case management sharing her example of not being allowed to talk about religion in case management. She was instructed by trainers and her HQ headquarters policies not to avoid religion in discussions with clients, GBV survivors, whilst on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, we can see psychologists who actually offers space for religious resources of survivors to come to play. Okay, so the table on the next slide is going to explain in more detail what these approaches were about. A minority of respondents actively accounted for religion and sought to engage with religious leaders and incorporated faith in SGB prevention and response. And reactive approach that was expressed by majority of respondents. They have referred to religion to a certain extent with relative faith sensitivity. Those in this category talked about relative view of religion. They've seen religion as multidimensional, could be simultaneously transformative and oppressive. They would talk about their ways of engaging with faith leaders, training them in local GBV advocacy. They would develop guidelines how to work with them. They would conduct resource mapping and actors mappings. And then some would talk about problematic and cultural interpretations and selective readings of religious texts, some recognizing religion as an important coping strategy. In the reactive instrumentalism, as you can see at the bottom, the second from the bottom, this describes respondents who prefer to avoid religion but engage with it as means to achieve their operational goals in a religious context. So they would like to use religious leaders to convey anti-GBV messages, for example. In reactive pragmatic approach, service providers account to religion mainly in their psychosocial activities, building on strength-based approach and resource orientation. One very important point noted is about data collection. Actually, none of the organizations collected religion disaggregated data, and some have raised that GBV IMS is collecting this data, but it's not clear how this data is used, whether it informs interventions. And it was problematic in some settings because some recognized that religious identities might be exposing people to additional layer of vulnerabilities. So such data would be helpful for them to mitigate this risk, these vulnerabilities. Okay, and in split approach, this is where first, personal stance would incline people to engage with religion, but organizational practice on religion did not align, and secondly, and they would have different approaches across regions. For example, an organization in one country would like to engage with cultural analysis, and in the other country, they would not conduct such analysis. All right, in an inactive approach, that's what I would like to highlight. It is where people don't engage with religion. There is rather faith insensitivity. So that's where survivors' religious beliefs are ignored and avoided. Most commonly, it has been reported at the HQ level, which infused the humanitarian microsystems. The default approach to religion seemed to be influenced by the binary interpretations of humanitarian principles, for example, neutrality and partiality, which led to perceiving religious engagement as a risk to neutrality and impartiality. Some respondents said that many work with religion with precaution, which somehow might have enabled faith exclusion in GBV interventions. In results, faith needs of displaced survivors and spiritual attentions in GBV experience have been often overlooked. All right, so interestingly, participants also rated faith sensitivity of the existing HGBV guidelines, and they rated them at from 0 to 10 at 4.13. So some have also mentioned that guidelines do not mention religion just in self-care sections of the guidelines. The second point I want to make today, and I know I'll be probably urged to finish soon. Next slide shows about religion in GBV experience. Here, just I wanted to highlight that some studies document religion as a primary resilience factor among refugee women, and women that I have met, they have engaged in very high levels of religious coping. However, religious coping mechanisms might have not been recognized by service providers in overall. Religion helped women to build resistance to GBV with help of protective religious texts. Religious identity and religious beliefs, on the other hand, can have also increased vulnerability at times, such as external contributing factors and internalized factors, especially in situations of limited faith literacy or context with religious persecution. I'm afraid I don't have much more time to go into it, but I would like to reflect on those 2 points of religion being as resilience and religious coping and intersecting vulnerability in HGBV experience. And in the next slide, I note this disconnect between how service providers approach religion in crisis and how women experience religion in GBV experience. There's a limited recognition of how religion shapes women's experience, and there is therefore a need to build upon women's resilience, spiritual capital, their religious resources and capacities to cope with GBV experience, and also to recognize intersecting vulnerabilities. So it's important to mitigate risks, and indeed, religion never comes on its own. It's always related to other socio-ecological factors. So what's the point for humanitarian practice? In the next slide, I would like to highlight that religion works together with other factors. Religion, if it's missed out, we are missing out on understanding the reality of survivors and perpetrators. As religion is part of GBV experience and survivors of faith have spiritual needs, it is important to ask and to develop ways to adapt interventions and mitigate potential negative effects. So there are 2 implications I would like to highlight. As for GBV guidelines, we know that religion is one of the characteristics that may shape survivors' specific needs. So this is important to be recognized to support healing. Therefore, MHPSS practitioners might consider to ask, recognize, and support and link to useful religious resources for survivors of faith. Indirect approach limits opportunities for supporting survivors in ways that resonating with their worldview and strength-based culturally adequate interventions. And I would like to also advocate to mitigate potentially negative effects associated with religious identity and religious beliefs. In the last slide, there are just a range of recommendations. So just to keep top highlights, the four highlights. First, integrate an intersectional and ecological approach to GBV. Consider in intersectional analysis of GBV religious factors and recognize intersecting forms of violence in the continuum of violence, and consider to sensitively disaggregate data when possible by religion. Second is about survivor-centered approach, the importance of recognizing religious, spiritual, and faith, non-faith coping strategies to strengthen coping mechanisms. Consider diverse resilience expressions, healing patterns, recognize religious needs as part of well-being in faith communities, recognize the link between religious coping and mental health. It's not always positive, it can also have negative consequences. And third, invest in capacity building to engage with religious factors. Faith literacy as a cultural competence needs to be strengthened. We need to support safe spaces for women to discuss their faith and empower each other from within their joint resources. And GBV guidelines might consider religious factors to mobilize faith resources and faith actors. That's the last one. It's about recognizing religion in MHPSS and resilience frameworks, and consider positive and negative functions of religion in coping behaviors. So that's it from me now. Sorry for taking a little bit longer. I encourage you to read this article that we have written with colleagues recently, as well as there is a range of webinar series by Safe Havens. They have engaged with different faiths in producing guidelines how to engage with survivors of faith across faith traditions. Thank you for your time, and sorry for taking a bit longer. Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you so much. And now we'll move to our second speaker. Remember, you can add any questions you have for Sandra about her presentation. Please put them in the chat, and she'll try to respond. So thank you. Dr. Ramina Istrati, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you'll be changing the slides, correct, Sarah? I'll just say next.
Yeah, just say next and I'll do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, thank you to you and Sandra for inviting me. I had Sandra in a webinar a few months ago. It was lovely to have her, and it's lovely to be in this. I have about 11 years working in international development, work anthropologically and ethnographically to incorporate religio-cultural belief systems in development practice. I teach religions and development at SOAS. I taught previously. Currently, I'm in Ethiopia, and I lead the project Dildil, which works to develop religio-culturally sensitive domestic violence alleviation systems in the 3 countries, working with clergy, theology, and belief system, religio-cultural belief systems. And so my presentation today is titled Understanding the Colonial Legacies that Underpin Engagements with Religious Parameters in Humanitarian Response and Public Health. I'm doing a leap of faith here because I work in international development, and I'm moving mostly in public health, not in the humanitarian sector per se, but I think many of the trends apply also to the humanitarian sector, especially now that I am working in Ethiopia in the Tigray crisis, and I can see how the humanitarian sector behaves. And the reason I want to place emphasis on the colonial legacies is because they can help us understand those inclusivity, exclusivity issues that Sandra mentioned, and the way we engage, the way the sector currently engages or not engages with clergies. Very much the theories and the paradigms and the knowledge systems, the abilities paradigms really in this practice. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to just mention very briefly graphically is what the system is comprised of currently. I think it's good to have a visual. So the current system of knowledge production is very unequal. It is characterized by epistemological dominance by Western Europe, North America, and other industrialized societies, which tend to dictate theory and knowledge because they dominate in knowledge production and publishing and so forth. The other aspect of the system is material, really. Give priority to Northern societies and Western researchers and practitioners. And as a result of those, the standards of practice, whether international development or in the humanitarian sector, but donors look for are very much informed by these societies' priorities, whether it is working according to theories of changes, results-based, value for money, and concepts such as impact and capacity building. And thirdly, the system is characterized by ideological and political asymmetries, again, very much defined by this dichotomy between center and periphery, between northern societies, industrialized societies, and southern societies, low and middle income societies. And again, while these fields seem to be led and guided by international agendas, what we call global agendas, they're very much culturally embedded within northern societies' systems.
Dr. Istrati, maybe you can turn your camera off because we're having a breakdown of the language. We can't hear you.
And again,
The connection seems to be quite rough. I'm not sure. Now we can. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, it's raining here in Addis Ababa, so I think it's making the connection even worse.
Yeah, no problem. We'll
soldier
on.
Okay. Excellent. So let's move to the next slide. So this is overall, a very asymmetric knowledge production system that, guides practice on the ground. And I think we need to be very aware of. I know epistemology is a very academic term, and I just wanted to just break it down a bit for all of us. Being epistemologically situated means that essentially our theory, the way we think, the way we analyze the world, the way we do practice on the ground, wherever we are, is very much informed by our own belief system, our own the system, the context in which we are socialized. So we need to be very reflexive that we don't transpose assumptions informed by our own belief and system of socialization to foreign contexts. And historically, the Western European colonizers through colonialism projected their worldviews and their own understandings of humanity onto the other. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o, with whom you might be familiar with, has described colonialism, the most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. So, it wasn't just a material political colonization, it was cultural colonization and epistemological, cognitive colonization. And in some ways, this continues today, is what we call neocolonialism or coloniality, because we fail to recognize how the theories that we use and the practices that we continue are informed by the same system and the same assumptions that remain colonial, essentially. And also because we're not very reflexive oftentimes about how our own personal positionality in research, knowledge production, or development practice can transpose, again, assumptions that may be foreign and might be relevant to the context we work in. Next slide, please, Sarah.
Yes, and if you could slow down a little bit, I think our interpreters are struggling to keep up.
Okay, sure, I will. So the first thing I wanted to mention, to look at, was the term, the concept of religion, essentially, which comes from the Latin word religio, and is very much informed about how Western societies experience Western Christianity, essentially, and how that evolved through capitalism and secularism. So historically, religion has been theorized in ways that, again, resonated with the different philosophers and theorists and anthropologists and ethnographers of their time, and it was analyzed, again, most often the religions of other peoples and traditions and communities was most often analyzed in reference to Western Christianity, which was considered superior. So that means that religious studies and conceptualization of religions do still have some assumptions that might be informed by that experience. And although in recent years, this epistemology of religion, the way we conceptualize religion within our Western frameworks has changed and diversified, we have moved to what we call the world religions paradigm. So we pay more attention to diverse religions. There are still various humanistic assumptions about the notion of religion and its place in society that continue. So for instance, the separation between religion and culture very much follows this humanistic belief. But actually, as you may know, in many low and middle-income tradition-oriented societies, that separation is not really realistic. We can speak of religio-cultural experience, really. They can be distinctive theoretically, but in lived experience, those are intermeshed. So, there's these kind of assumptions continue in various disciplines, including gender studies and the feminist movement as well, which have tended, again, to apply, their own experience with Western Christianity, which was at times patriarchal and sexist onto other traditions, especially those traditions that seem to resemble Western Christianity, whether it is other Christian traditions or other faith traditions. Next slide, please. And again, these assumptions continue around gender relations as well, and they coexist. In terms of how we analyze gender relations, we tend to, equality has been defined on the basis of Western experience with sexism and what gender equality should mean. How gender itself is conceptualized, again, has been predicated historically mostly on biology and visual indicators, which there have been critiques about, especially by African anthropologists. Gender relations are not, or gender identity is not defined solely by biology, just seeing men and women and defining the relationships, but many other cultural beliefs and parameters that are not always visible. So they speak about world sense and holistic understandings of gender. And again, as a result of these assumptions, which carry into other concepts such as empowerment, conceptualizations of empowerment, interventions that have pursued gender equality have not always been attuned to local belief and value systems. In other words, those concepts are assumed, are theorized based on Western experience, and then not much research happened to really discover them within local religio-cultural systems, which means a lot is missed, most likely. Next slide, please. And finally, lastly, similar colonial legacies continue when it comes to how we theorize GBV and domestic violence, because again, these have very much been theorized in reference to gender, right? To the concept of gender and gender relations and gender inequality. So the same assumptions carry into this discipline as a consequence. So for instance, much GBV and domestic violence in low and middle income countries have been justified on the basis of what we call social, cultural, or feminist theories, which tend to find fault with gender relations primarily and cultural systems. And that kind of has led to incubate, to consider culture as something negative. And as a result, a lot of scholars would argue actually that this is a continuation of colonial legacies, and especially beliefs that existed historically, that African cultures tend to be inherently violent, for instance. So the justification for the violence must exist somewhere in the culture. And again, these kind of assumptions need to be questioned, because even unconsciously we might perpetuate them, as underlying assumptions. Next slide, please. So what is the outcome as a result of these colonial legacies that we don't always think about, but do exist in various concepts that we use and assumptions and theories? As a result, very little research has explored alleviation strategies within religious worldviews. In other words, because religion has been seen as something that is backwards, and Western societies have moved to secular systems, and because culture has been seen quite, suspiciously, there has been quite little effort to not only research how domestic violence is experienced within local religio-cultural systems, but also how these same religio-cultural systems can become resourceful in addressing the problem. And while in the international development sector, for instance, in recent decades, since the 2000s, really, a lot of integration of faith leaders and religion, as defined in the mainstream, has happened. Because there is more acknowledgement that religious leaders are very influential in local communities. Again, these approaches have not overcome entirely Western assumptions about what religion means. And usually there's a lot of talk about institutional religion. So, churches and mosques and hierarchies and religious leaders, but very little faith-inclusive approaches that are holistic, that consider the multidimensional ways in which religious traditions influence, social life, gender norms, the human psychology, relationships among people, and the experience of IPV, and again, victim and perpetrator attitudes. And it's the same pattern in public health as well. So I won't go in detail there. Next slide, please. When it comes to the humanitarian sector, we were privileged to have done a literature review recently in order to respond to the humanitarian crisis here in Tigray in Ethiopia, which has been characterized by extensive SGBV violence and other forms of violence. And we conducted this literature essentially to understand the relationship between violence and war and domestic violence, and the long-term consequences of political violence more generally. So that exposed us to the humanitarian sector and the kind of scholarship that exists currently in the current practice. And generally speaking, we reviewed more than 200 studies in that short period of time we had available. And it evidenced that religious parameters have received minimal attention in the humanitarian sector and should be better integrated because they seem to be quite influential and resourceful in particular. So as Sandra mentioned, the faith tends to serve as a coping mechanism for victims and survivors. And not just in SGBV war-related emergency contexts, but generally in everyday life, in peacetime. So for instance, the domestic violence literature on faith would agree that female victims oftentimes resort to religious beliefs to condemn the abuse and find the strength, to overcome their situation and take action. Anthropological research that I conducted in Ethiopia in the countryside for about a year, and I analyzed the conjugal abuse in the countryside from a religio-cultural framework, evidenced again, I had more than 244 interviews, and again, evidence that faith helped women to face and overcome difficult situations and painful marital experiences. So it was really a medicine to trauma. And the clergy in particular were very central in mediating marital problems and conjugal abuse, and oftentimes materially supported survivors. Of course, there were other limitations in the sense that oftentimes the clergy were unprepared to respond to the problem with sensitivity and safeguarding issues, safeguarding concerns in mind. And the fact that oftentimes faith might be used to justify the behavior, because again, we need to remember that perpetrators exist in a highly religious context where the religious tradition is highly authoritative. So inevitably, their justifications will be framed in religious terms. So of course, religious parameters can be used negatively, but that doesn't mean that faith in itself and spirituality cannot be resourceful and is not resourceful, which it is. So it is important to recognize again that faith, as Sandra said, and religious traditions exist within cultural folklore practices and norms. And while we need to distinguish them within our minds so that we really identify the resourcefulness of theology and religious language, we also need to understand that they coexist in everyday life. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was very interesting. And again, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. The speakers will be monitoring the chat. So I'd like to invite our next speaker to come speak, Dr. Elizabeth LaRue.
Hi, thank you. Let me just get everything up. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Research Director of the Unit for Religion and Development Research at Stellenbosch University. Now, today I draw on different research projects that I've done in different parts of the world over the past 13 years to pose 3 questions that I think is relevant to today's discussion. The hope is that these questions help all of us, whether we come from the religious sector or the secular sector, help us look more critically at our own practice in how we engage with religion around GBV in humanitarian settings. Now, humanitarian response, I believe, has to be highly attuned and responsive to local context, and it is this focus on the local that allows me to engage more critically with our practice. In that sense, this presentation is therefore also part of the broader localization of aid debate. If we are truly looking at religion and religious actors at grassroots level, what should our humanitarian response look like? Next slide, please. I'm expecting, actually I'm hoping that each of you will be made uncomfortable by at least one of the questions that I'm posing. Please remember that I'm also challenged by these questions. Now, for religious actors involved in addressing GBV and humanitarian response, I'm sure there's a sense of relief that they're now being included in the conversation more and more acknowledged as partners. It wasn't always the case. For secular actors in the same space, there may be relief that more holistic GBV prevention and response is now possible. But I am increasingly worried that all of us might be becoming a bit complacent. I believe that both religious and secular actors are not looking critically enough at themselves and how they're identifying and including response in humanitarian settings. As a side note, I use the terms faith sector and secular sector while fully realizing that these are false, well, it's a false and problematic binary. So I'm still going to use it though, as it's an acknowledged shorthand. Next slide, please. I've done research in a host of settings affected by humanitarian disaster, and international faith-based organizations are almost always present and doing important humanitarian work. But it was research done in Colombia with internally displaced communities that made me fully aware of the important and, dare I say, under-recognized role of local faith communities in humanitarian settings. Next slide, please. Amongst other things, the study looked at sexual violence and church responses to it. The research highlighted the important role that local faith communities, so in that case it was churches, can play in addressing GBV. These were not faith-based development organizations, they were churches, sometimes tiny ones, based within IDP communities. By focusing aid and partnering with churches that already understand GBV and have shown their commitment and ability to respond to it, even if such response was quite small or limited, it can mean that assistance can be rolled out much faster. But such partnerships are very rare. Usually, humanitarian actors only work with the recognized traditional mainline local faith communities. So in Colombia, that's the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. But we tend to see little or no engagement with the independent or less mainstream local faith communities, even if their reach is huge. So, for example, Pentecostalism has increased dramatically in Latin America and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Yet there's usually very little engagement with these types of local faith communities. Now, the research in Colombia also highlighted that it was usually female religious leaders who were aware of and responding to GBV. However, they were usually in junior positions or even just lay leadership roles within the church. Now, incidentally, this has been true of every single country, setting, and religion that I've done research in. If we only engage with the top level leadership of local faith communities, it may mean that we're missing out on those who are most able and willing and driven to address GBV. You actually have to be quite intentional in order to be able to identify those leaders. So to conclude the first question, I think we as secular humanitarian actors or international faith-based humanitarian actors, we're often quite limited in terms of the types of religious actors that we engage with in humanitarian settings. And I believe GBV prevention and response suffers as a result of this unwillingness to look further and wider than the mainstream. Next slide, please. I think we often work within a problematic binary of religion versus culture. Often only certain religions are acknowledged as religion, for example, Christianity and Islam, while African traditional religions, on the other hand, is often dismissed as just culture. And this means that some religions and some religious actors are dismissed because they're not seen as religious. We also often see that only certain parts of religion is recognized as religious. So, for example, sermons on Sundays or prayers on Fridays, those are religious practices. But if a religious community has spiritual rituals and practice, so for example, dancing or bathing in the river or body painting rituals, those things were not so comfortable and they just dismissed as cultural practices. Next slide, please. But by limiting what we acknowledge as religious, what we recognize as religious, we limit the role of religion in GBV prevention and response in humanitarian settings. Allow me to illustrate with another example from Colombia, but this time from a different study. Last year, the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls asked myself and a colleague to conduct a synthesis review of practice-based knowledge on VOG prevention from their body of evidence. So 89 projects conducted over a 5-year period. And one of the projects we studied in more depth was Fundación Mundubat in Colombia. Next slide, please. So in designing their support strategy for GBV survivors, Fundación Mundubat drew on indigenous and Afro-Colombian rituals by recalling and reclaiming ancestral practices. So women were encouraged to recall what their mothers and grandmothers taught them about ways of healing the body and the spirit. Water, rivers, medicinal plants, these were all integrated in a psycho-spiritual, culturally relevant accompaniment for survivors. And drawing on these ancient indigenous practices also brought healing, not only for the trauma of violence, but also for strengthening their cultural identity and sense of self. Now, the psycho-spiritual work by Fundación Mundubat highlights how religion and culture should not necessarily be understood as independent, separate belief systems. While these women drew on ancient cultural rituals, these rituals had spiritual meaning. And remember, in reclaiming these practices or any ancestral, cultural, religious practices, it's rarely discussed in humanitarian response or in GBV prevention and response. Yet the work in Colombia illustrates the power of cultural rituals in bringing healing to survivors and strengthening their support structures and pathways. Again, I believe if we do not pay close attention to the reality on the ground, we do not see the interconnectedness between culture and religion and the powerful practices and rituals that can support humanitarian response. So again, this is a call to look to the local. Next slide, please. There is a risk that we instrumentalize local religious actors in humanitarian response. This risk is not only something that secular actors should consider, but again, also religious humanitarian actors, especially, I would say, big international faith-based organizations. Next slide, please. Is there always recognition and acceptance of what local religious leaders are and believe? For example, their reliance on sacred scripture, their belief in the impact of spiritual healing. These are often dismissed or sidelined or even ignored by secular actors or bigger international FBOs, faith-based organizations. I believe it's true in international development in general, but I think it's particularly true during humanitarian response activities because there's this urgency and need to respond to the crisis, and that then justifies the dismissal. Yet, their religious nature, it's not simply a characteristic of these actors, it's their defining characteristic. It's what shapes their motivation to respond and their way of responding. So trying to avoid or marginalize it means avoiding and marginalizing the influential dimension of what makes them impactful. Next slide, please. Furthermore, a lack of religious literacy can lead to a fundamental misunderstanding of what local faith communities can do, but also of what they might struggle with. This can lead to a frustration or impatience when they don't do what is expected or what is seen as a priority. So the research on IDPs in Colombia illustrated this dilemma. For example, religious leaders whose churches were actively involved in addressing GBV at length discussed the dilemma of justice versus redemption. So on the one hand, as individuals responding to survivors, they feel strongly that justice for survivors, it's important. That as Christians and Christian leaders, these faith leaders are challenged by the notion of redemption and the possibility of change. So should redemption be what they, as religious leaders, should be providing for perpetrators? But what then of the survivor and the need for justice? So what I'm trying to illustrate is that for many local religious leaders, their faith, as well as their embeddedness within the community, makes it challenging and taxing to respond to GBV. It does not mean that they don't want to do it, but it does mean that even the most simple interactions can be filled with doubt and indecision. And that's why they may at times find it difficult to follow hard and fast regulations for response and prevention. Their intimate knowledge and embeddedness, which is their unique contribution, means that they're challenged by the wider and longer impact of their responses on the community, but also on their faith. Next slide, please. So I have no time left, and I realize that it is a very short presentation that can't do justice to a reality that's complex and demanding. But nevertheless, I hope that this challenges us all in how we engage with the local during humanitarian response and how we recognize and include local manifestations of religion and religious actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was very interesting. You know, this topic, we've done a disservice to our speakers by limiting them to 12 minutes, but that's because we want to hear from you, the participants, and the people out there in the community who are looking at these issues. So now we're going to move you into your small discussion groups, and you're going to have a chance to both talk with the different facilitators who will share a little bit of their experience as well. So we have about 30 minutes, and we also have created these jam boards, which are kind of just a whiteboard, you know, a chalkboard that you can write your comments on too. So if you don't feel confident speaking aloud and you want to just put something up there, you can, or you can just add your different thoughts. So again, due to the technology limitations, We can only offer French translation for the breakout sessions. So the people who need French, you'll just stay in plenary. You will not move into a breakout room. Everybody else, you'll be put into, we pre-assigned you into different breakout rooms. And if you end up being in the one that you don't want to be in, you can just stay in the plenary and let Shiva know. Just type into the chat and we'll move you into the one you want to be in. So ready or not, here we go into the discussion groups, and best of luck. And I hope you have a great opportunity to chat. As you move into the groups, I will also just tell you they will not be recorded. Okay. So everyone's still in the plenary. If you shouldn't wish to join one of the breakout groups and you don't wish to be in the breakout group that's going to be led by Francesca, just type it into the chat and we'll move you. And Francesca, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I just wanted to check, should we still be recording this part because it's now the kind of breakout?
Okay, so let's get back to our groups. I mean, I think we had an interesting technological experience. One of our groups, I think, only had 2 people in it, and some people lost their facilitators, but we'll do the best we can. Maybe we'll start with you, Francesca, if you don't mind. Do you want to summarize group 5, a little bit of what you had to say? And then we'll ask Sana, and then Lisa, then Juliet, and then Sandra.
Great, thanks. I think what we touched on quite a lot was the importance of understanding multiplicity of faiths and faith expressions. I think particularly linked to the presentations by the speakers, and looking at the kind of non-formal, non-structured religions, trying to undo this false dichotomy of culture and religion. And so the importance of understanding what are the different spiritual practices and how to engage them when they're less kind of structured with a clear hierarchy and operating procedures. And Dr. Romina was sharing about the importance of, or the usefulness rather, of ethnographic practices as a way of listening, building trust, learning, and building solutions together. So yeah, we're trying to understand the kind of multiplicity of faiths that might be having an impact within a particular community. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll ask Sana if you could summarize a bit.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So we were discussing about the need, how we can work with the faith-based organization, and there were many comments around it, and it was basically the understanding of custom and traditions. For example, when they were discussing in the presentation of going local to understand the different religion. So there is a need to understand the context of the situation, to understand the dynamics and between the religious and leader organizations, and you know how it's going to work, the power dynamics. And then we have to recognize the gender dynamics within faith leaders, for example, if how it's going to work, because when we talk about the context of Iraq, for example, so it's mainly about patriarchy and how this different roles are going to you know, intersect with each other. We also talk about one of the colleagues, she shared about her experience in Turkey. So there is a mechanism which is led by government of all these leaders, faith leaders, and engaging them in the GBV prevention and response. So how it's going to, because in Iraq we don't have a government defined role, but we are a humanitarian organization. We have been including these people in our GBV prevention and mitigation strategies. So then it's basically on us that how we are engaging them. The next thing was about how we are, if we are in a faith-based organization, how we are going to work with different faith leaders, and what are the support and tools. So it's basically most of the colleagues, they agree on that we have to identify common values and understanding of common goal, that how we can work together. So there were some comments about negative consequences of engaging faith leaders and compromising humanitarian principles, neutrality, impartiality. So we discuss about it, and it was like my experience is that we also have to agree on some of the humanitarian principles when we are working with the faith leaders. We have to really look into the like-minded faith leaders who can potentially work with us for raising awareness and advocating for GBV prevention. So this is the things we have discussed, and it's also available on Jamboard.
Great, thank you so much for that. Lisa, maybe you can share with us what your small and intimate group shared.
Yes, so we were a really small group, which allowed us to go totally off topic. So we have notes on the Jamboard, but they're not really related to the question. So while our participants are not part of faith-based organizations, so secular organizations, they had very positive experiences of engaging with religion and religious actors and resources. A key lesson learned is actually that their organizations aren't opposed to the idea. It's just something they didn't think of. So if you raise it, if you suggest it, there's openness to it, but it won't come from the top. It'll have to be someone who asks for this and kind of drives this form of engagement. But very positive experience in terms of how religious culture and rituals and resources have brought support for survivors, examples of how traditional practices brought trauma, healing for child soldiers, child marriage engagements, and seeing that you have this default assumption that religious leaders will be more conservative and opposed to these ideas, whereas it's the same as the rest of the world, that with teachers or any other group, you have people all across the board in terms of how they feel about these issues. It is tough. It's a sensitive topic in many other countries. GBV is very sensitive. Religion is very sensitive. So it's difficult to get access. It's difficult to phrase it correctly. So you have to be really cautious in terms of how you introduce topics and how you phrase it. Yeah, so we actually talked a lot more about experiences, about lessons learned, about challenges of people who have been engaging with religion, even though part of what's traditionally viewed as secular organizations. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, that's great. I'm glad that you had the chance to talk very closely. Unlike Francesca's group, which had, I think, 33 people in it. Next, can we hear from Juliet, your group?
Okay, thank you. From my group, Africa, I think the number in the group were really large, and issues reported on the Jamboard and some we discussed openly, they were all bordering on the diversity of religion in Africa. Africa, we have so many religions, and the religions have different views concerning gender-based violence. When some religion will group children from 11, 12 to be of marriageable age, I mean the girls, and while some other religion will say, no, it's not that. So that issue is a very big problem in Africa. When you're in an area where a religion that accepts child marriage is dominant, it's now becoming very difficult for you to group one under the gender-based violence victim, because the religion may not accept that. And somebody raised the point. He asked, then how do we now handle issues for those who don't believe that gender-based violence, that children, girls at certain age are victims, that is normal, is what both religion and their culture accepts. And two, we cannot generalize many things in Africa because we have diversity. We cannot generalize issues concerning Christians or Muslims in our view to GBV. Again, someone was saying that, is it true that African traditional religion brings justice faster than every other religion? This is an issue as well because of a lot of superstitions around the African traditional religion. They believe that the matter there is handled much faster. You may not really understand, if you're not from Africa, you may not really understand what this one is talking about, but I understand fully well, because some go to African religion, traditional religion to look for justice, and it's as if it gets it faster, but that's the jungle justice, like the way we generally we look at it. So that's the diversity. But I believe that African traditional religion, all religions in Africa, they all have word for the hurting. And when one is hurting in any form, even if it's not openly done, the person should be able to get help from religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. And last but certainly not least, our co-host and the person whose idea it was to have this webinar, a member of our community of practice who brought it to us and asked us to help organize it. Sandra, please.
Thank you, Sarah, and for all your generosity. Well, our group was consisted of 8 people, and we have shared topics from across socioecology. So we started from this macroeconomic thing, which relates to humanitarian principles. We had a suggestion to develop guidance on working with faith-based organizations on GBV, including how to do it in ways that wouldn't risk the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality. So how can we work with FBOs and maintain impartiality as not mutually exclusive endeavors? I think this is definitely possible, and we should explore how to do it. The second comment related to GBV responses and working with faith leaders. Unfortunately, well, that's the reality. The examples that we have heard are more related to faith leaders being being perhaps in some degree a barrier in allowing women to reach safety. So, for example, in situations of APV, faith leaders were that was an example from East Africa. There was a desire to help, but the principle of persevering families, keeping couples together, and the mediation between couples would go often in the way that would prioritize keeping families together. Divorce was stigmatized, and certain values perhaps have upheld this attitude, well, this reality. So opportunities to engage with faith leaders would be helpful, to know how to work in such dynamics, how to work with faith leaders to assist survivors of intimate partner violence and allow exit from marital unions, I guess. And there was also an idea to gain guidance on discussing GBV and sexual rights and health rights of leaders of different faiths, to support GBV respondents in ending stigmatization and motivating people to provide safe space and offer confidential support, including signposting. So this is a suggestion for guidance development. Then there was another suggestion, I think from the Pacifics, that's related to developing opportunities for dialogue between gender-based violence responders and faith leaders. So to recognize that they don't need to work in silos, they can collaborate, and we need to perhaps develop guidance how to do it in efficient ways in different settings. And finally, there was a response from an FBO who pointed to this reality of stigmatization and faith values undermining perhaps survivors' well-being within FBOs themselves. So we can see FBOs, faith-based organizations may struggle with the same social norms and attitudes that undermine survivors' well-being, and it would be important to also develop guidelines for FBOs how to tackle shame and stigma around divorce, for example. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to close this webinar by thanking our fantastic speakers, Sandra, Dr. Israti, and Dr. LaRue. Sandra will soon be Dr. Pertek, I'm sure. I'd like to thank our facilitators as well, Sana, Anthony, Juliet, and Francesca, plus the people who jumped in to support and help. Really big thank you to the interpreters who keep us going in other languages and are often overlooked. So thank you, interpreters. And then finally to my colleagues, Philippe and Shiva from the GBV AoR, who keep everything going in the background and sometimes in the front ground. Thank you again. If you'd like to join us at the GBV Community of Practice, or if you want to look at all the different things that the AoR offers for you, you can see it here on this slide, but you can always just go to our website at the gbvaor.net or send us an email at gbvcop@gmail.com and join us on the Community of Practice to keep the conversation going. Thanks again for your time. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye too.